Hi everybody, I'm Paul and this is Game Turtle. Shelter 2 is the second in a series of animal survival-based action-adventure games developed by Might and Delight. I've already reviewed the original Shelter, so feel free to check that video out. But for efficiency's sake, I'll sum up my thoughts from way back then. I adore the original Shelter, and consider it a brilliant case study of the unique strengths of games as an art form and as an emotionally rich experience. It's a game with mechanics and gameplay working in perfect harmony with its thematic elements. These form together to create a smoothly paced, exciting, and emotionally taxing journey wrapped up in exceptional sound and visual presentation. The original Shelter is a game that I care about deeply. Anyway, with that context out of the way, let's jump into Shelter 2. Shelter 2 went in a different direction to the original game. Shelter 2 is open world, a far cry from the original and its tightly linear adventure structure. The world is separated into a number of different areas joined by loading screens, and the player can explore and hunt freely. Despite this change in structure, there's very little added to the game that the original didn't have mechanics-wise. Gameplay features of the original game, from guiding a litter of small animals to feeding them, to keeping track of how well fed each distinctly coloured child is, are carried over into Shelter 2, with minor or no alterations. The specifics of movement and stamina have been refined, but the biggest mechanical change comes with the fact that you're now playing the role of a more overt predator, the lynx. This isn't to say that you don't still have enemies, just that hunting is more important than ever before. If you want your lynx cubs to survive till adulthood, then you'd better keep them well fed. The game does an amazing job of making you care for and worry about the lives of these small cubs, and the game's most tense moments come when their lives are put at risk. As an adult lynx, you can deal with most situations, but your children certainly can't. The game is at its strongest when you're scrambling for food for a sick cub or seeking protection from an unprompted foe. The game is visually gorgeous with a number of varied and vivid environments, and the soundtrack and sound design is even more pleasant than the first games. The music team of Retro Family have created a poignant and soothing score which suits the package tremendously well. The character models and their animations are charming, though sometimes they do bug out a little. The lynx cubs in particular are wonderfully cute, complete with their own high-pitched yelps. The environment is appropriately vast, and the game even goes to the trouble of giving you a vague map, so you can never precisely pinpoint your position. There are a stupid number of inconsequential collectibles spread throughout the world, but these lack in any real value except to completionists. The game world itself is interestingly laid out, however, and so exploration is its own reward, really. This is mainly due to the game's aesthetics, though, as the climbable geometry of much of the scenery is messy and clunky to navigate. The mountain DLC adds an additional area to the map, which does have some splendid sights and views of its own. One big difference between Shelter 1 and 2 is in the nature of the set-piece events. In Shelter 2, randomly occurring events can take place based upon the player's current location and the current season. These are not certainties, however, and as a result I only experienced one such event on my first playthrough. In fact, the entirety of my first playthrough consisted of me choosing a direction and eventually travelling through all of the game's multiple separate areas until I was tasked with returning home to the shelter. Throughout, I was hunting to keep my kittens fed and faced a single stressful moment where one child was sick and not eating. I later managed to nurse the lynx cub back to health. Outside of this, there was one frightening wolf attack which claimed one of my cubs, and the rest of the game was spent hunting and gathering, a satisfying if repetitious task. On my second playthrough, I did admittedly encounter more of these events, though partly that was due to me researching them and finding out about them and their criteria to take place. These events are mostly what you'd expect from a wilderness setting, predominantly being various different animal attacks on your family, but they are certainly exciting and shake up the game's drawn-out pace. One event in particular, the Lake Blob event, was mysterious and alien, and I found it really intriguing. I'm not even sure what it was supposed to be, but as far as imagery goes, it's certainly pretty damn striking. One aspect of Shelter 2 which I find interesting is the way that different areas represent differing levels of difficulty. The tundra area is prone to wolf attacks and prey are sparse, for example. The central area is plentiful in smaller prey, but eagles often nest there. The Mountains DLC adds an entirely new area, the most complicated in its layout, and adds in a number of unique threats. As the player, you can really move wherever you would like. For example, in my first playthrough I travelled the map, hunting as I went, and I lost one of my cubs in a sudden wolf attack which I didn't know how to deal with. Constantly moving certainly took time away from hunting, but I never had a real issue with finding food. In my second playthrough, I spent the entire time at the lake where prey was plentiful and had a far easier time of it. It's an interesting way of allowing for self-imposed difficulty, with the urge to explore pushing against the inherent risks involved with that exploration. There is a survival mode, effectively a hard mode, which adds even greater challenge, but even just where you decide to graze has a large effect on the game's difficulty. Another strange aspect of the game's difficulty and pacing comes with the nature of the game's structure. The game runs through the seasons twice over, the cubs grow into adult lynxes and eventually leave you. It's effectively a game of feeding 4 lynx babies until a series of timers count down. The game even gets easier around the halfway mark when your cubs grow and can hunt for their own food. You can't lose, though arguably it would feel like a loss if all your cubs died. Unlike Shelter 1, where narrative progression is driven by the player's actions, Shelter 2 pushes the theme of survival, with narrative being interspersed at the end of each timer countdown. I don't really like the shift, though that's personal opinion, because it necessitates a gameplay loop of waiting rather than acting. Given the survival aspect is repetitive and arguably not challenging, at least on the default difficulty, the game falls back on the appeal of its world and audio-visual design to carry it through. And to be fair, those areas are where the game truly shines. It's just a shame it's lost that clarity of purpose that Shelter 1 had. The emphasis has been placed on entirely the wrong areas, with its repetitive hunting in a mostly safe environment forming the core of the player's interaction within the game. The ending also felt far less powerful, though still charming, though that's mostly due to the repeating family tree nature of the game. Each cub that survives to the end of the game can be used as the protagonist lynx in each subsequent playthrough, and so you can stretch out a large tree of your own little lynx family. I appreciate the idea of it, and I can definitely see that being a strong reason for some to return to the game. The game is definitely designed for repeat playthroughs, as evidenced by the family tree feature. I've seen people on the game's Steam page with hundreds of hours of playtime, so clearly the game's offering appealing longevity for some. It's a pleasant, stunningly presented, and occasionally tense world to exist within in 1 to 2 hour intervals, and I understand the appeal of that. It's a game which I have no doubt emotionally resonates with some people, and there are distinct heartwarming moments in Shelter 2 for sure. It's just a shame they can only really be felt below the surface of the far more traditional gamey aspects of the experience. Shelter 2 is assuredly a game which some people will adore. I still think it's a really special game. It just misses the mark in a few areas. Unfortunately, I can't help but long for the purity that made the first game such a beautiful thematic work. The move to open world doesn't add to the core experience, and the random nature of the set-piece events lends the game a potentially plodding pace, far from the superbly paced linear progression of the original Shelter. Shelter 2 still offers a pleasant romp through the wilderness as a family of critters, and I do respect Might and Delight for trying something grander in its scale with the sequel, but for me at least, it never reaches the glorious artistic peak of its predecessor. If Shelter 2 were the first game in the series I'd played, I would no doubt be won over by its thematic child-rearing mechanics, brutal consequences, and the exceptional audio and visual design. But as it stands, the game brings little new to the table that really makes it stand out for me, and lacks the focus that made the first game so powerful. It's still far from a bad game, and I can appreciate the love and care that went into it, but the journey of a Mother Badger and Shelter 1 resonated far more with me than this. Paws is another game in the Shelter series, and is considered a Shelter 2 spin-off. Paws is an action-adventure as usual, but it returns to the linear progression of Shelter 1. In Paws, players take control of one of 4 lynx cubs, with their mother acting as leader of their pack. It's a swapping of the roles from Shelter 2, where players protected the little ones as the solitary mother. It's an interesting switch, and playing as the vulnerable one is a neat spin on Shelter's formula up until this point. You're a predator, you're a lynx after all, but in this case you're still a baby, and as a result you're always vulnerable. The game has a tighter narrative to it than Shelter 2, though that's almost entirely due to its return to linearity. Players live through the early days of this litter of cubs before the time to move to new Shelter comes and the family heads off into the wider world. It's during this time that the family becomes separated from the player's cub, and so begins the journey to return to your family. A neat touch in Paws is that the default name for the player's lynx is Ina, the default name of the first mother lynx in Shelter 2, suggesting Paws tells the tale of the original mother lynx as a child. The intro is set up well, and functions as a nice down-to-earth tutorial of sorts, as well as developing a connection to your protective mother lynx and your siblings. You can roam around a moderately large but confined space, but your mother will always rush to retrieve you if you venture too far from the group. It's a nice little intro that builds the emotional weight leading up to the initial conflict. The separation scene sneaks up on you, and it certainly took me by surprise. The rest of the game is spent making your way through a couple of areas before being reunited with your family. Along the way, you help out a bear that becomes your companion for part of the journey. The game as a whole is exceedingly short, which I don't normally have an issue with on its own. However, the game reached its ending really abruptly, and it honestly felt like I was just hitting the game's stride as it ended. The final area offers 2 endings based on your actions, which encourages a second playthrough. However, neither really felt super rewarding. They were nice conclusions, sure, but I think the game really suffered as a result of its unusual pacing. The game looks and sounds as good as the series ever has, which is to say it's excellent. Environments are varied and seem to be more densely populated than ever for the series. It's the little pretty details in the environments and sound design that really bring a lot of charm to the experience. As far as gameplay goes, Paws doesn't exactly shine. It's an adventure game like its brethren, but the devs went for more of a platformy level design, and as a result added a proper jump button to the player's actions. This really influenced a lot of issues that the game has. The entire game has been designed with this jump action, but outside of a minute number of wide ledges, the only real practical use for the jump is to ascend steps built into the levels to allow for a greater degree of verticality. This is all well and good, but the way jumping has been implemented leads to a lot of mechanical complications. In short, it's all pretty buggy. Shelter 2 had issues with its scenery geometry, but the worst of this can be found in Paws. In my first playthrough, I clipped through terrain and got stuck inside objects numerous times. In one section, I even got trapped in a perpetual cycle of crashing into walls underneath a river. The jump action makes exploration risky, as one can easily get stuck and have to restart. One time, jumping onto the bear even caused my game to freeze. Speaking of the bear, it was unfortunately one of the lousiest AI companions I've ever had. The bear's an idiot. His movement is all over the place. He sometimes decides to stop still while you're waiting on him to clear a path for you that you're not allowed to jump over. Sometimes he gets confused and dashes around, and by the nature of the game's gravity, he sometimes slides right off the ledge while he's zipping around. It all looks really strange and makes the bear more of a nuisance than a lovable companion he's supposed to be. It also doesn't help that the game makes use of cookie-cutter AI partner gameplay. Only your partner can open certain doors, or rather eat certain bushes, and you have to occasionally set up a fallen tree to ensure the bear can get to you. It's as dull as it comes gameplay-wise, and not engaging at all. Just like with Shelter 2, the gamier parts of Paws really lessen the experience as a whole. The series' strengths lie elsewhere, and so obfuscating the core of the game with this sort of gameplay just doesn't really add anything of worth. The game just feels messy, really. It's a sweet story, and there are touching moments, but they're wrapped inside this chaotic mix of poorly implemented mechanics. There's one event in the game that just really highlights the game in all its messiness. At one point, you're looking for a tree branch to lower to allow your bear companion to climb up to you. On your way to the branch, you make your way through a misty swamp area. As you enter, you hear a howl, and after a few moments, a fox charges at you. Unlike the ghostly fox you saw earlier as a scent-induced flashback, this fox is coloured accurately. It certainly looks like an actual fox, as opposed to some sort of ghost fox. So you're being attacked by this fox, and you've got to get out of the swamp before the fox finishes you off. But whenever the fox tackles you, it disappears and rematerializes in the same section of the swamp and charges you again. I guess it makes it easier for the player to see, having the fox attack from one area, but the way it just disappears and pops into existence across the swamp from you is really weird. Maybe it is meant to be a ghost fox, but it can actually hurt you, so it doesn't seem like it. It's easy to just sprint to the other side of the swamp and climb out, so this moment that seems to be a big conflict of the journey just kind of ends with a whimper. It's over before you know it. It's just so representative of the whole game. With a strong concept, it's heavily implied that the fox ate one of your siblings. But the execution leaves a lot to be desired to really have that emotional weight they're going for. The bear is the other character you're supposed to really warm yourself to, but the game is built in such a way that makes this really hard to achieve. The only moment of the bear being actually helpful to you, the player, is if you somehow lose to the fox in that previous section. The bear saves you and nurses you back to health. Besides being a cute bear, there was really nothing else that warmed me to it during the bulk of the game. He would stuff about and not eat paths for me, and then when I did want to move forward, he would rush away to stuff his face elsewhere. A lot of those reasons were because of his AI being all over the place, and just generally being buggy, but he was really irritating as far as adorable bear friends go. It's really hard to criticise so much of Paws, because despite all that, I had an enjoyable time. It feels like a side story for sure, and it's just a shame it didn't live up to its full potential. The audio-visual style that Might and Delight have honed is on full display here, but I have trouble recommending this title in the series over the others. It feels like a sloppier version of Shelter 1, and Shelter 2 at least tried to take things in a different direction. It's a heartfelt journey, but one that brings with it a host of technical issues. The series has never really been free of technical issues, but they really get in the way for the first time in Paws. I can appreciate the story that the devs were crafting here, but it really lacked the appropriate building blocks to make it a truly emotional journey. Much like Shelter 2, it feels like a wealth of extraneous features have been added in to the detriment of the core experience. Paws is an average game, but it's certainly one that's been made with a lot of love. The Lonesome Fog is a short animated picture book set in the world of Shelter 2. It's part of the Shelter 2 package, so I thought I would mention it here. The book revolves around a lynx cub who is consumed by fear of the world around her and runs away. She meets an unlikely friend and they help counsel each other before the lynx returns to her family, changed by the experience. The book makes the most of the lovely visuals that the devs are well known for at this point. Dealing with fear is the core message of the story, with fear shown as a lonesome fog that sweeps over everything if you let it. It's an important lesson, especially to children, and the story pushes the idea of improving yourself as a person and always striving to be better and emotionally stronger. It's a sweet little tale, and one I'd have no issue recommending to be read to young children, especially framed as it is by its exceptional presentation. Thanks so much for watching, and have a terrific day. Feel free to like, comment or subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw.